the Chatham Masonic Hall, or the Chatham Masonic group, they were dwindling in numbers, and also the same thing was happening in Newcastle. Just to give you a little background how this building became vacant, they were approached by lawyers for the Hutchinson family. The Hutchinson family donated at the turn of the century a lot of stock in the Bank of Canada to the Masonic group, which they kind of lost track of. It was supposed to be used for the Associated Lodges building across the river. It was supposed to be used for the upkeep of that, and they were using it for all sorts of reasons, and they kind of lost track of it. But after 100 years, the lawyer came back and said, okay, this is what has to be done with this money. You have to put it into this building, you have to do this, you're using it for the wrong purposes. And they didn't realize how much money they had. Make a long story short, this building came up for sale. They all moved to Douglastown, both groups, the Newcastle and the Chatham Masonic groups. Now, some of you who have better knowledge of this little bit of history might correct me on some of the details, but regardless, this building came up for sale, and we were able to purchase it, and it's now a tremendous home for a museum. And I always make this point, when I walked into this building, if you look back here, there was an altar, or I guess a raised portion of the building. I looked at it and I said, that would make a perfect spot for the upstairs display case in our old museum. So I walked over to the old museum, measured it. There's 1 inch on each side in the difference. It fit so perfectly. So right there I said to myself, this is the spot. It just fit there so perfectly. So we just deconstructed that art display case, as well as all of these. Majority of these display cases and the majority of the artifacts came from the old Miramichi Natural History Museum. So yeah, when I seen that fit perfectly, this was the spot. It took us a while to get the money to buy the building. The Masons were generous enough to lease us the building until we raised the money. Yeah, so this is our new home, and we're glad to have it.
Let's go along the inside here and see what we have.
Well, as I said, we start here with a lot of our native Canadian artifacts. This little section here is more on the ferries that used to go up and down and across the river. We have a lot of pictures of the ferries that used to ply the Miramichi. We have a beautiful example here of folk art. There was a gentleman, excuse me, the name escapes me, but he made this little folk art model of the Francis Ullacos, which was a very well-known ferry that used to ply, they could go across the river. If you could see, now isn't to scale because definitely these cars are too small, but it's, as I say, folk art. And we actually have the nameplate up here. If you see, the actual nameplate from the Francis Ullac is up there above.
At the top.
Yeah, up in the
Way
top.
up, and I'll call Rusty.
There we go, yeah.
Do you want someone taller to bring it up? Oh, sorry.
And we have a lot of artifacts from the museum, the ferries. For instance, right here we have some tickets from the Francis Ullac life preservers, and they used to have these transfer printed little doodads here, the little tip plates and the creamers and whatnot.
Mementos, eh?
Mementos, yes, I guess, for tourists, yeah. And we also have life preservers from the Loyalists. Now this here, I always point out here, and some of the older folk, now I shouldn't say that because I'm getting there myself, but I barely remember the ferries, but this here, the Loyalist, if you look right here, it's the railing. And we actually have a piece of that right here where people used to carve their names into it. So we get people in here looking for their initials and whatnot, which is kind of unique.
One of a kind there, brother.
Yeah. And this might be a good time to point out to any of the viewers of this, if you have anything unique like that, now that is a unique piece of Miramichi history. Same as that Francis Ullac sign. Both of these things were donated by people from the Miramichi who thought, what am I going to do with this item? They realize that the museum is a perfect spot for it. It will be preserved here forever. So if you do have anything unique to Miramichi history, anything unique that you believe would find a good home in our museum, contact me. And
What is your contact number or email or what?
well, we have a site on Facebook. That's what we use mostly. It's called Friends of the Miramichi History Museum. But also my number is 625-9106, or you can come to the museum in the summer. We're open from June to September, but by appointment after that. We have a lot of people coming in here doing research, want to get private tours. They just contact us either through our Facebook page or give me a call, and I open it up and let whoever in wants to come in when on our off-season months.
Which is what we're actually doing here. You're giving us a private
Yeah,
tour.
exactly. Yeah, which is it's great. It's great to get the exposure. Yeah. We got a lot of examples of seafaring items here. I like to point out this sailor's sweetheart Valentine. Now, I was under the impression, and a lot of people, that those were made by sailors and long journeys. They'd be traveling on the open seas for months and months, and they would gather seashells and make them for their sweethearts. But I recently found out that those were made by people in, I guess, native people in certain countries, Jamaica and whatnot, and sold to the sailors. And they would tell the story that they made it themselves. So it's a little bit of trickery there. I didn't know that fact until recently. And we have a nice example of a sailor's sextant, spyglass or telescope, megaphone. These are all seafaring items. Log books. As I said, this is a very unique item here, a diorama of a gentleman's, his name was McCarty, Dave McCarty, yes. He made this in the 1830s of his recollection of what the town of Chatham looked like from his area across the river. And it's a beautiful little diorama of...
Talk about detail. Eh?
Yes, it's just really, really well done. And that was done... As I say, all this stuff is donated to the museum, and we feel blessed that people from the Miramichi give us this stuff to hold for them. It's very, very unique items.
Got a nice combination of steam-powered tugboat and still sail.
Yeah. A little example of the native people here in their canoe. It's very, very well done. Yeah.
I'm looking at the brass plate and I'm thinking 1835. Right here, there's a date there.
I think that's the year he made it, 1935.
19?
Yeah.
All right.
But it's the recollections of his youth in the 1880s, I believe. Maybe before we go farther down, I'll just point out some of the stuff on this side of our display cabinets. We have a nice collection of fossils here. As I was mentioning to John earlier, we have this all documented in our files. The founders, Dr. Cox and Dr. Baxter, would contact the coal companies down in Minto, Cape Breton, and say, if you find any fossils, please send them our way. And here's a large example. We have more downstairs, but these are some of the nicer ones. We have this fossilized palm tree down below. If you look down below, that was ballast. Some of you might be aware that ballast was when a ship was empty, they had to put weight in it so it would be more buoyant. So if they were coming across the Atlantic, they would put rocks and stones in the bottom of their ship and they would dump them, and there's actually a ballast island across the river. It's just made up of all this ballast. But this was found there. It was from a Scottish ship, and it's a fossilized palm tree that was brought over as ballast in the 1800s. Found its way to the Natural History Museum.
The ballast island would be just downstream from the Douglastown Marina.
Exactly, yep.
And it's certainly not a palm tree growing where the ship came from.
No.
It had to be traded up there or put in as ballast from wherever, right? The
Yeah.
Spice Islands or wherever.
Exactly. It probably had
Wow.
a very unique history before it even made its way to the Miramichi.
But you know, and where did you say that it was brought over from?
Scotland. From what we have documented, the people who brought it over believe it came off a Scottish ship, a ship that came over from Scotland. So.
But if it's sandstone, it's probably 200 to 300 million years old, and there may have been palm trees growing at the time on that soil.
Exactly, yep. If in fact it originated in Scotland, as you say,
Well,
it could have
yes.
been part of ballast from another country, yes. That ended up in Scotland and
Yeah,
then was brought over
right.
to Miramichi.
Right. Like the continents have moved around quite a bit in the last 300 million years.
And if you look on the next cabinet, we have a very extensive collection of Stone Age tools and artifacts that were collected by a well-known Canadian archaeologist named Dr. Henry Ami. A lot of these came from northern France, and we have examples of axe heads right down to arrowheads. A lot of these are obsidian cutting tools. Now, I always use this as an example when I'm giving tours that this museum used to be, as I say, a going concern. The museum at the time had its own publications. They had, as I mentioned earlier, they had artifact exchanges with the Royal Australian Museum. They had exchanges with the Smithsonian Institution. When Dr. Henry Ami passed away, he left 1/3 of his collection to the federal government, 1/3 to the Redpath Museum of McGill, and 1/3 to our museum. So he thought a lot of our museum to leave this collection with us. And back in the day, there was no internet, no television. People were lucky to have even encyclopedias. So they would come to a museum like our museum back in the turn of the century in the 1920s to see examples of geology, examples of coral, things that they wouldn't see anywhere else.
Well, back then, of course, encyclopedias, you had to have money to have the extra money to go ahead and buy encyclopedias. But a lot of families were concerned about how do we get to tomorrow or next week, and about printing.
I remember when we moved from the old museum to this museum, I received a letter from a gentleman in Moncton saying how happy he was that we were keeping this stuff alive. And he remembers he lived in Chatham, and he used to hop on his sled and slide down Wellington Street to go to the old Natural History Museum when they had guest speakers there. And he said the crowds were fantastic, and they would have the magic lanterns out with displaying the pictures on the wall and someone talking about natural history. And it was a really, really fantastic letter. It really brought it to life how all these things played a part in these young people's lives because they couldn't see it anywhere else. And well, actually for myself, that's why I became involved in this museum. Growing up on Church Street, which is just around the corner, in the old museum, I spent a lot of time going into that old museum, just touring around and just looking at all the artifacts. And that's probably part of the reason, well, I was always interested in history, but that's probably part of the reason I went on to become a teacher majoring in history. We've got a lot of examples of whale bones and coral. Like coral, some of you may be aware that coral, if you were in, say, Australia and you tried to take some coral out of you'd get arrested pretty quick. So this stuff is not on the open market anymore, and we have a lot of examples of it. We've got seahorses. So much stuff here.
Incredible, huh?
This little section here, and if I'm going too fast, just so you know, this is kind of devoted to Joseph Conard. As many of you may be aware, Joseph Conard was one of the I guess, prominent businessmen and shipbuilders in this part of the Miramichi, especially in Chatham. Him and his brother, well, particularly his brother, Samuel Kennard, who was situated in Halifax, he got the contract to deliver the mail between England and British North America, Canada. And that's how he started to build steamships, and his brother kind of joined in eventually, Joseph, after he left Miramichi, and that's what became the Kennard steamship line. Very prominent company to this day, although in England it's called Cunard. The Cunard steamship line. They still have the Queen Mary and other ships, but it's a business that's still going. And in the mid-century, they were the company for shipping. If you wanted to cross the Atlantic before airliners were prominent, that was the company, Cunard or Kennard.
I think Kennard and White Star at one time were separate companies.
Oh, definitely. White Star was the company that built the Titanic, and they went bankrupt after the Titanic disaster, and it was purchased by Kennard. Yeah.
Fire sale price.
That's fire sale prices. And we have the ledgers here of the Kennard business from every business transaction ever performed by Joseph Kennard in the town of Chatham are documented in these ledgers. Now, these were, people often say to us, are they documented anywhere else? We sent these to the archives in Fredericton, and so they're all documented in Fredericton, but every ship they built, every nail they sold, every part of their business is documented in these books. It's a treasure trove of Miramichi history. The names, the documentation of the ships, the documentation of all the transactions between Joseph Kennard and everybody are all found within these books. And I always point out to kids that back when these were done, there'd be a gentleman at a desk who would spend his whole day just writing in these books in longhand, cursive writing. And if you go through these books, there's hardly ever a mistake. And it's all beautiful penmanship, all these books. And kids today don't realize that back then, this wasn't a unique thing. Everybody...
Well, writing was part of life for those that had, education.
Yeah.
It's amazing. It's amazing.
Yeah. We have so much stuff here. I tend to lose track, but I always point out a lot of this taxidermy, this came from the old museum. This stuff a lot of this was from the 1880s and turn of the century. Some of this early taxidermy here was done by our founder, Dr. Philip Cox, especially these early ones right here of the lynx and the bobcat. And I always point out here, when he was starting out, he did a lot of his taxidermy on small little creatures. And we have some of his very first attempts at taxidermy here. I know it's a little bit morbid, but it's part of our history and it's part of the museum's history, so I like to point it out that everybody starts somewhere. He started on the small little critters and worked his way up to the bigger ones, I guess.
The British had a great tradition of taxidermy from all over the world. And this is what they did, and they stocked the British Museum with artifacts from all over the world. Whether they should have been doing that or not, but they went into countries and said, "Okay, I'll take 3 of those, please," and they took them.
We have a little cabinet, and you probably won't be able to see this on video because it's a little bit glaring. But we have a little cabinet of curiosities here that the kids really like. For instance, we have armadillo shell purse that they used to sell for a tourist item. We have shark jaws here. We have spider monkeys. We have a 4-legged chicken here. Now, I always point out to the kids, this isn't real, the 4-legged chicken. Somebody made that as a goof. But this is one of our well-known items. Everybody remembers the 8-legged cat. It's a little bit dusty here, sorry. Here, if you would, John, just take the bell jar off carefully. This is our famous 8-legged cat. If you look, it has 2 bums and 8 legs. It's what's called a spontaneous mutation. It only survived for 2 days. But it was born to the cat that belonged to Dr. Mackenzie, who owned a drugstore here in town, and he was a prominent pharmacist. We actually have a lot of examples of his bottles and his medicine paraphernalia here. Anyhow, after it died after 2 days, he got it stuffed and put it on the counter of his drugstore to bring in people. And it worked like crazy because it was written up in the New York Herald newspaper. It was such a unique item. But anyway.
Dated around 1900.
Yeah, this was the turn of the century, yep. Everybody remembers, we have, I always, it's kind of a pet peeve of mine. As you're aware, I just showed you many, many, many unique items we have here, but everybody remembers the 8-legged cat. Have you been to the museum? Oh, that's the place with the 8-legged cat. Yes, and many other things.
I guess, huh?
And as I say, this here is pretty unique here too, an eye, which is a very rare example of a lemur from Madagascar. I talk to the kids and I say, you ever see the movie Madagascar? This is very lifelike, believe it or not. It's very, very weird looking, but it's a nocturnal lemur from Madagascar. But as I say, we put it in our little cabinet of curiosities here with the puffer fish and the mongoose and cobra fighting and the horned toad, ostrich egg. And the kids love it.
Talk about this canoe here.
Oh yes, that canoe there. It was built by George Curtis.